Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? I just get a wave. I'm sure you can. I can't hear you, obviously, because you're muted. So I hope you're having a great morning. Thank you, first of all, for everyone who's involved in making this morning start. My name is Kween G, and I'll be your host for the 5th Refugee Alternatives Conference. I was looking forward to seeing you all in person at the university in Parramatta, but of course, we're all in the same situation, trying to stay safe. So I just want to extend an extra thank you, a round of applause to Adama and everyone, Sama, who's been kind of communicating and making this happen online. It does take a lot of energy, work, and effort. You've been listening to the music of Gordon Koang, a Nuer speaking musician hailing from the Upper Nile region of South Sudan and accompanied by his cousin Paul. Gordon performs a blend of traditional Nuer music, rhythms and compositions in English, Arabic, and his native language. You can check out his music at gordonkoang.bandcamp.com. Support his music, purchase it. I'd like to introduce this year's conference theme, which is Rebuilding Resilience and Innovation. We will reflect on the lessons and challenges experienced in the past year while navigating the global pandemic and continue conversations that have taken place in the previous years while highlighting the positive efforts and work of grassroots policy at a policy level and specific focus on voices from people with lived experiences. Before we begin, though, we must acknowledge, we must embark on this journey together for the next couple of days. And I'd like you all to join me and Uncle Greg Sims for an acknowledgement and welcome to country. Uncle Greg is a well-known activist for reconciliation, a traditional woodcarver, a storyteller and educator of Aboriginal culture. Uncle Greg's ties to the Aboriginal community of the Greater Western Sydney are through his ancestral links, the Gundungara people, the water dragon lizard people of the Blue Mountains, and the Gadigal whale people of the Darug Nation. Growing up in La Perouse and now resident of Greater Western Sydney, Uncle Greg is also a member of the Western Sydney University Indigenous Elders Advisory Committee. Please join Uncle Greg Sims now. Thank you.
Hello friends, it's good to see you. My name is Greg Sims. Everyone knows me as Uncle Greg. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge we're on Darug land. I would like to acknowledge elders, past and present. We don't own the land owns us. We come from Mother Earth. We are the land. And the land we're upon today belongs to the Mathematical tribe of the Darug Nation, the Eel people. Where I fit in, I come from the Gadigal tribe of the Darug, which is based in Sydney, and there I belong to the Whale people. Also belonging to the Gundungara Nation in the Blue Mountains, where I belong to the water dragon lizard mob. On the south coast, I belong to the Buttawang tribe, the beach plover, which they're a tribe of the Yuin Nation, the black duck. I'm one of the Aboriginal elders of Western Sydney, and becoming an elder, you have to do lots and lots of work in your community before you get respect in return. And we as elders, we go out and teach how to break down barriers and build bridges. We're out there trying to turn people's lives around. So when people do come to this sacred country, they forget that our people are the First Nation people of this sacred land. And they think all Aboriginal people throughout the country speak the same language. You know, we have well over 500 dialects in this country. In New South Wales, we have well over 136. So this must have been a multicultural country before settlers came here in 1788 and the ones that followed. By saying this, we are all Australians. And we as Aboriginal people, we don't exclude people from the circle. We want people to come to the circle, share their values and stories. We will never have knowledge if we don't do this. Once we start learning from each other, then we're heading in the right direction towards the reconciliation. And don't you think the music would sound much better if we use both the black and white keys? And I'd just like to say that I'm I'm an Aboriginal elder of Western Sydney, also one of the Aboriginal elders on the advisory committee at the Western Sydney University. And it's an honour to be an elder and carrying all that wisdom and knowledge to share that with others. So when we look at Aboriginal people, our people were the greatest counselors, psychologists the world has ever known, greatest conservationists, greatest scientists, and greatest astronomers. That's just Aboriginal people. And we're out there, we want to share as much as we can with non-Aboriginal people because they'll always be part of our heritage and culture. So I'm here today to give a welcome to country for the Parramatta South Campus. But just before I do, I would like to say one more thing, is that when we take our next step, just remember the ones that walked this sacred land before. Te are mara, tara ka pemal. Kami mari a pemal na gara reki babana. Vai namira waranang. Nai desi guy, Diana Gamma yara lang. Na gara reki tiari na gara reki na gami guy. Do you winning gonna go? Tala lawi mukukat bala na gami.
Thank you again to Uncle Greg Sims. I haven't seen Uncle Greg Sims for a while, so it's nice to catch up with him virtually there. I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of the land of which I meet you on today and where you are as well, and pay our respects to the present and emerging elders who are to come. I'd also like to personally say, my own connection to, here in Sydney, Australia, coming here as a refugee, seeking asylum with my father in the early 90s with my brother. We came from Uganda. We come from the Bugishu people. I'll hopefully have time to share more about my own journey in the next couple of days throughout this conference. But, it is very important that we do, as African people and wherever we've come from, get to meet, acknowledge, sit with, talk to, and get to know the original people, the Indigenous people of the land. And, we get to see how much similarities we have here. This is a place where I found my purpose when we first came here. It's where I fell in love with music. I'm a hip hop artist and an MC, and I get called upon often to host many different things. And the space of, refugee rights and activism is somewhere where, I do a lot of my work. I'd also like to acknowledge that NAIDOC Week is celebrated this week from the 4th to the 11th of July. And this year's theme is Hill Country, which calls for stronger measures to recognise, protect and maintain all aspects of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and heritage. I'd also like to extend a welcome and a hello to everyone who is participating in this. We have so many, hundreds of participants who are on this webinar throughout today, tomorrow, and throughout all the sessions. So just want to extend an extra hello and thanks to everyone in advance, and thank you all for speaking and taking your time to do all the work that you do. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Paul Power, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Refugee Council of Australia. Paul has been the CEO of Refugee Council of Australia since 2006. As head of the National Umbrella Body on Refugee Policy, he helps to lead NGO advocacy with the Australian Government and the United Nations agencies. Since 2012, he has served in leadership roles with the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. Paul was a member of the Australian Government's Refugee Resettlement Advisory Council between 2008 and 2014, and NGO co-chair of the Global Dialogue on Refugee Resettlement between 2011 and 2012. Paul previously worked in the NGO sector as a media officer, trainer, researcher, and manager, and in the newspaper industry as a journalist and editor. Please welcome Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kween G, for the introduction and for your work today and tomorrow as our conference MC. I'd also like to thank Uncle Greg Sims for his welcome to country. I was born and raised on Darug land, but I'm sorry to admit that I was an adult before I knew much about the Darug people and their ancient and continuing custodianship on the land on which Western Sydney was built. Being in lockdown, I'm at home in outer southwestern Sydney on the land of the Darawal and the Gundungurra people. I pay my respects to the past, present and emerging elders of the Darawal, Gundungurra and Darug people, and to Indigenous elders of the lands around Australia from which all of you are participating. Happy NAIDOC Week to all Indigenous Australians and, in fact, to all of us. NAIDOC Week provides an opportunity for Australians of all backgrounds to deepen our understanding that we are on ancient ground, home to the world's oldest continuing culture. Inevitably, we are left to consider whose land is this anyway, and to think more deeply about the concepts of welcome, exclusion, and inclusion. And these concepts are central to the themes that we are considering over the next 2 days. This is the 5th Refugee Alternatives Conference. We delayed the timing of the conference by 5 months in the hope that we might be able to gather in person again and enjoy the friendship and networking which have been central to the previous 4 conferences. As of 2 weeks ago, we had people ready to travel to Sydney from various Australian states and from New Zealand and to participate in the conference. However, the spike in COVID cases in Sydney put paid to that, and an enormous amount of work has been done by my colleagues to shift to a fully online conference. We'll miss the opportunity to elbow bump in person, but here we are now, ready to engage with inspiring and challenging ideas from the comfort and warmth of our own homes and offices. This conference is a joint event of the Refugee Council of Australia and the Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University. The members of the Refugee Council who've put in the hard work to organise the conference are our Project Officer, Samar Shadar, our Director of Community Engagement, Dina Yako, and our Deputy CEO, Adama Kamara, 3 formidable women with lived experience of forced displacement. We've enjoyed a great partnership with the Whitlam Institute team, particularly the Director, Leanne Smith, Policy and Research Officer, Dr. Andrea Connor, and Institute Manager, Fiona Pacey. Congratulations to each of you for the way in which you've reorganised everything in the past 2 weeks to shift to a fully online event. We particularly appreciate the work put in by Tim Linden and members of the AV1 team who have brought the technical know-how to make this online conference work. In the 8 days since we announced that the conference would be entirely online, Adama and the team have sold hundreds of tickets. As a result, we have more than 450 people registered to participate in the conference, a record number for a Refugee Alternatives conferences. But one of the advantages of the online format is that we will have up to 6 weeks to view any of the content we've missed. So this is one conference where you'll be able to view what happens in every parallel session without the need for time travel. We are pleased to be joined today by the Chancellor of Western Sydney University, Professor Peter Shergold, a great supporter of refugees who has been highly effective in his advocacy with the New South Wales and federal governments. The university was very generous in making its facilities available for this conference, and in other circumstances, many of us would have been enjoying the surrounds of the university's Parramatta South campus, including the historic female orphan school, which is home to the Whitlam Institute. This conference has been generously supported by a host of sponsors, including our principal partners, Australian Red Cross and the Colin Biggers and Paisley Foundation, our major partner, Settlement Services International, our partners, Sydwest Multicultural Services, Communicare, Multicultural Australia and New South Wales Teachers Federation, and our sponsors, Core Community Services, St Vincent de Paul Society New South Wales, Hickson's Lawyers, New South Wales Refugee Health Service, and the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales. The theme of this year's conference, as you'll know, is Rebuilding, Resilience and Innovation. As with previous conferences, our aim is to bring new ideas and fresh perspectives to our thinking about refugee policy matters. When we organised our first conference in 2017, we made a conscious decision that it would not be a repeat of some of the refugee policy conferences that all of us have been to, where politicians, CEOs and academics speak with furrowed brows about burden sharing, border management and the refugee problem. We wanted to give much more prominence to the views and ideas of people with direct personal experience of being forcibly displaced. The end result, we found, was a conference which was simultaneously much more challenging and much more hopeful. You'll see again that over the next 2 days, that 70% of our presenters are people with lived experience of forced displacement, 35 out of the 50 speakers and facilitators. Our speakers will challenge and inspire us on questions of community organising, race and privilege, inclusion, human rights, the role of allies, and the place of partnership and the place of Australia in the world. I'm really looking forward to the next 2 days. Back to you, Kween G.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that great introduction and a bit of background into the conference. Our next speaker is representing our conference co-host and partner from Whitlam Institute within the Western Sydney University. Leanne Smith is an international human rights lawyer with a master's degree in public policy and, sorry, I've lost myself, and international affairs. Leanne has worked in the Australian judicial system for the Australian Human Rights Commission in the international NGO sector, regional human rights organisation as an Australian diplomat, and in various roles of the United Nations in field operations and at the UN headquarters in New York, most recently as a chief of policy and best practices for UN peacekeeping operations. She is currently the executive director of the Whitlam Institute in Western Sydney at the university and an adjacent professor of law at WSU. Her professional experience spans across Australia, Southeast Asia, Africa, the Balkans, and Afghanistan. Please welcome Leanne. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kween G and Paul. It's wonderful to be with you today. Happy NAIDOC Week, everybody. I'm joining you today from Parramatta South Campus, wishing you were all here. So I'm here on the Darug land of the Darug people, and I join you in paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I think the theme for NAIDOC Week this year, which is around healing land, is really relevant for us as well, participating in this conference, as we struggle to find ways to build back better and to think about how we can change the way we approach problems after COVID. The Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University is incredibly proud to co-host the 2021 Refugee Alternatives Conference. For those of you who don't know us yet, we are a national prime ministerial institute delivering distinctive, bold and inspiring policy research and programs that promote common ground, inclusive national identity and civic engagement for everyone in Australia. We're recognised across the political spectrum as delivering a nation-building agenda to, in former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam's words, help the great and continuing work of building a more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. I wanted to say a bit about why we wanted to support and co-host this conference since Paul and I began this discussion about 2 years ago. When Paul explained to me the purpose and the participants of Refugee Alternatives conferences, I was instantly keen to get involved. At the Whitlam Institute, we believe in putting communities with lived experience at the heart of policymaking. And in my experience, this is the only way to make successful policy with real impact. We're also committed to cross-sectoral dialogue and learning. The fact that Refugee Alternatives brings together people with refugee backgrounds, academics, service providers, advocates, policymakers, government representatives and other engaged individuals must certainly make fertile ground for new ways of thinking, learning and doing. And very importantly, more humane and constructive policies. Finally, in this, the 5th year of Refugee Alternatives and following on from so many great collaborations in other parts of the country, most recently in Brisbane, I was very excited to bring this conversation to Western Sydney. And although COVID has forced us online, the Western Sydney community is strongly represented in both the conference agenda and the topics, as well as with our participation online. Greater Western Sydney has one of the most diverse cultural communities in the entire world. The richness of our contribution as a region will be of great benefit to policymakers and practitioners alike on agenda topics included in this 2-day program, including grassroots volunteer work, race, power and privilege, community approaches to temporary protection visas, international responses to displacement, how Australia should respond to challenges in the Asia Pacific, the role of local government, and raising the voices of young people from refugee backgrounds. Gough Whitlam was a true internationalist, one who led sustained and strong engagement by Australia with its region and the world. He also saw the transformative power of international law to drive domestic law and policy reforms. The Whitlam government ratified 15 international human rights treaties in the space of 3 years, most notably perhaps the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which of course became the basis for the landmark Racial Discrimination Act of 1975. Treaties like this provide strong leverage for reform and for securing gains for the long term. They also give focus, legitimacy, and strength to the vital work of civil society groups both here in Australia and abroad. They're a tool to counter the public narrative in Australia surrounding migration and asylum, which, as we know, has become weaponised by misinformation and discriminatory practices, and even, unfortunately, racist attitudes. Now, there's a new international collaboration tool that Australia could have and could still embrace. This is, of course, the Global Compact for Migration, adopted by an overwhelming consensus of member states in 2018. And that compact reminds us that the human rights of migrants, of all migrants, must be respected, protected, and fulfilled at all times. The Global Compact inspires us to greater international cooperation to address destitution and environmental degradation, which compel people to flee their homes. It's about reducing inequalities, protecting the rights of all people on the move, and ensuring greater freedom and opportunity for all. Australia opted out of this important global discussion to find cooperative solutions. But if we refuse dialogue, inclusion, respect, and justice, we are in effect enabling injustice, cruelty, grievance, and tensions that will, of course, fuel greater conflicts. So it's my hope over the next 2 days that through this conference, we as a group can increase dialogue, inclusion, respect, and justice in our work, in our society, and beyond. So a huge thank you to Paul, to Adama and the RCOA team, and all the best to all of you for a fantastic conference. Thank you, Kween G.
Thank you, Leanne, for that very real reflection. I'd like to now introduce our final speaker before we meet our first keynote speaker. This is Professor Peter Shergold. He's been a Chancellor of the Western Sydney University since 2011. He's also the New South Wales Coordinator General for Resettlement. And in 2019, together with Margaret Piper and Karen Benson, he presented a report to the Commonwealth Government on refugee integration entitled Investing in Refugees, Investing in Australia. Please welcome Professor Peter Shergold.
Oh, I've got to go. I think I am unmuted. Thank you, Kween G. Thank you for that music to get me going this morning. I have to tell you all that Western Sydney University, through the remarkable Whitlam Institute, is proud to co-host this 2021, the 5th Refugee Alternatives Conference. And I'm proud to do so alongside with that wonderful advocacy organisation, the Refugee Council of Australia. Now, of course, I would have so much preferred for us to be meeting face to face. You know, a fortnight ago, I spent a wonderful, energising week at Western Sydney University graduations, where I was able to talk with students and their proud parents in person and to, you know, pose side by side for innumerable celebratory photographs. Unfortunately, I'm now, like so many of you, back in isolation, here for me on Ngunnawal land in Canberra. And I'm back to dressing Zoom style, shirt, jacket, even a tie on my top half, and perhaps, just perhaps, trekkie pants and furry slippers on my bottom half. But let me say something that is hard to convey online, namely that I am truly delighted that we are able to come together, even virtually, in order to take a critical, a disruptive, but an aspirational approach to rebuilding resilience and innovation in our perceived capacity to accept and to welcome and to integrate refugees and asylum seekers to Australia. And of course, I am particularly happy to co-host through the Whitlam Institute, which sits within Western Sydney University. You know, this is a university which now has well over 700 students who came to this country as refugees. It's a university which offers more scholarships to refugees and asylum seekers than any other Australian university. So for us, refugee students are absolutely central. They allow us to prove person by person, family by family, that Australia does have the capacity to continue to be a country of opportunity in which economic and social mobility is available to all. And I'm delighted also then to welcome you as the Chancellor of Western Sydney University, but it is perhaps wearing some of my other hats that I've responded so enthusiastically to the idea of refugee alternatives, which underpins this series of conferences. Now, let me explain. Back in 2015, New South Wales Premier Mike Baird put pressure, courageous pressure, I think, on the Abbott government to respond more generously to the destructive tragedy being fought out in Syria and Iraq. And he committed that New South Wales would do more than its fair share in helping to settle larger numbers of refugees. And the truth is that we did. The Premier asked me if I would assist as part-time Coordinator General of Refugee Resettlement, to assist using my public service experience to try and ensure that the state's publicly funded investment in the increasing numbers of refugees could be delivered more effectively through implementation of much better integrated education and training and employment and health and justice and customer service programs. But I've got to say, with license from the top, in the process, I think I've been able to demonstrate more innovative ways of delivering settlement services. I've had the chance to pilot alternative ways of trying to engage frontline community and advocacy organizations like the Refugee Council, like the Asylum Seekers Centre, like the Red Cross, like SSI, like STARTS, to involve those organizations in the co-design of government policy. I've been given the leeway to explore an alternative way of ensuring how the lived experience of refugees and asylum seekers can actually influence the way in which programs get delivered. Since then, back in 2015-16, I think that much progress has been made in New South Wales in making non-government organisations partners, genuine partners with public service agencies, and with beneficial results in terms of cooperation, in terms of collaboration, most of all, in terms of outcomes. But of course, there is more, much more to be done. And then in 2019, with my friends and colleagues, Margaret Parper and Karen Benson, I was asked by Prime Minister Morrison to present the Commonwealth Government with some alternatives, alternative ways of administering an effective refugee program that would help the full civic integration of refugees into our multicultural society and labour market. We suggested, in addition to having refugees selected in cooperation with the UNHCR on the basis of humanitarian need, that the government could also trial new programs of sponsorships based on community or employer or university. And I am very pleased indeed to see that later in this conference with my friend Lisa Button and others, you're going to explore some of those alternatives. Now, I'm an optimist. I still believe there is government interest in such innovation, but I fear the requirement that Margaret and Karen and I saw and still see, the requirement for additionality may have deterred the government's embrace of such new approaches that have such intrinsic appeal and potential benefit. But in that report, it was called, as you've heard, investing in refugees, investing in Australia. There were two even greater alternative approaches suggested, alternative ways for the Australian government on behalf of we, its people, to articulate the centrality of the refugee experience to Australia's national psyche. There were, our report suggested, a couple of elements of that alternative. A, to see the admission and the acceptance of refugees, not just as a societal problem, as Paul described it, not just to view the refugee experience through the lens of social deprivation, but rather to celebrate what many refugees offer to a liberal, democratic nation and open society, to acknowledge how they bring energy and risk-taking and determination and family-centered entrepreneurship and a proven capacity to overcome personal tragedy and trauma and new challenges. In short, we promoted the importance of government publicly recognizing the value of productive diversity. You know, I wrote about the productive diversity presented by different languages, different cultures, different global perspectives more than 30 years ago, when I headed the Office of Multicultural Affairs set up by Prime Minister Bob Hawke. I had the chance to oversight the drafting of our very first national agenda for a multicultural Australia. That was in 1989. It was then an alternative way of looking at newcomers. Rather sadly, too often it remains an alternative viewpoint today. But finally, our report also highlighted an even more profound alternative to the prevailing narrative. It emphasized the need for political leaders to lead. It highlighted how the refugee experience could be changed if governments were willing to do so and were willing to take the lead. If governments were willing to evince public pride and personal confidence in our humanity, in our underlying decency as a nation, in our proven capacity. Over 75 years, we have provided waves after wave of displaced people, refugees and asylum seekers with a new home. And in doing so, we have created a more vibrant, multicultural nation in which all of us whose families have come here as migrants of one sort or another at some time or another are respectful of the unique role of our First Nations. So that's an alternative. It's such a simple but profound alternative that might be put in place so easily. And so this conference, I think, can play a valuable role in exploring such different approaches. So with now no more ado, let the strategic conversation begin. I look forward to listening in as we start. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter Shergold, and thank you for taking us on a bit of a timeline to understand some of the alternatives that you've mentioned there. I'd like to now introduce our first session, but before we do that, I'd like to just give you some housekeeping on how we're going to flow through the day. There will be some preliminary sessions, there'll be some breaks, quick morning breaks after the sessions. Parallel sessions after lunch would be at 2 p.m. and you can choose the parallel sessions you've registered for, and you can find the links on the virtual hub. Remember to click on the evaluation links to give us feedbacks on each session. It will only take a minute or two to complete the form, and leave your contact details and you'll go in the draw to win a limited edition hard copy of our Share a Meal, Share a Story cookbook. And you'll be one of the first people with a hard copy of the cookbook. And this book has mouth-watering recipes from Australia's refugee communities with cuisines from all over the world. With each dish comes a special story. 3 winners will be announced each day of the conference, and you can find the links on the Humanities Virtual Hub where you access the session links. A QR code and your URL will be shared on those slides. The official hashtag for the conference is #AltRefugee. So hashtag capital ALT Trefugee, so alt refugee with a capital A. We thank our co-host of Whitlam Institute in Western Sydney University and our principal partners, Colin Biggers and Paisley Foundation and the Australian Red Cross. You can use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen if you need assistance from the conference team. Have a great conference and feel free to ask any questions or leave comments in the Q&A or chat window, and we'll do our best to get to them. I'd like to now introduce the opening session, which goes with the opening with a theme for the conference, Rebuilding Resilience and Innovation. The opening session will provide a critical reflection on refugee and asylum seeker matters. It will explore themes of dignity and the importance and impact of language. The panel will take a critical, disruptive, and aspirational approach and explore opportunities for change in the sector. I'd like to introduce the facilitator from the Refugee Council of Australia, Adama Kamara. The session will be moderated by Refugees Council's very own Adama, who is a Deputy CEO of the Refugee Council of Australia. Adama recently joined the Refugee Council of Australia following a 10-year career in local government, working on place-based community development projects in Western Sydney. Adama has a personal and family experience of seeking asylum and supporting newly arrived refugees from her home country of Sierra Leone. She has a passion for community-led initiatives and an advocate for meaningful participation. She has led co-designed projects with young people, people seeking asylum, refugees, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and service providers. Adama, please introduce speakers. We'll introduce the speakers for the opening session and the facilitation. So thank you, and I'll be back with you after this session.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Refugee Alternatives Conference. I'm talking to you from Darug country here in southwestern Sydney. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respect to their elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So I'll start off by introducing the three panelists this morning. The first is Atem. Atem was born in South Sudan and grew up in refugee camps in Ethiopia and Kenya. He came to Australia in 2002 through Australia's humanitarian program. He studied at the University of Canberra and the Australian National University. Atem is currently writing a PhD thesis exploring the settlement experiences of South Sudanese families in Western Sydney. Atem understands the importance of community organising and has supported the establishment of several refugee community organisations. He's currently president of the New South Wales Refugee Communities Advocacy Network, and he currently works with Fairfield City Council in the role of Social Planning and Advocacy Officer. Our next panellist is Rahila Haidary. As a small child growing up in Afghanistan, Rahila was eager to attend school, but had to dress as a boy to gain entry. Subsequent threats against her family forced Rahila and her parents to flee their homeland. After many years of displacement and distress, Rahila arrived in Australia as a refugee. Since then, Rahila has become an outstanding young leader who has generously shared her own stories and used her rich intellectual capital to promote understanding of the refugee experience, strengthen cross-cultural empathy, and advocate for gender equality and human rights. She's taken stages nationally and internationally as a keynote speaker and has played a significant role in the documentaries, including Is Australia Racist?, to challenge discrimination and existing attitudes to refugees. Rahila works as a youth development officer in local government and is deeply committed to her work enhancing community cohesion and human rights. A final panelist this morning is Shakufa Tahiri. Shakufa holds a Bachelor of Law from Western Sydney University and currently works as a policy officer within the New South Wales Department of Education. She isn't representing the department today. She has worked previously as a policy officer with the Refugee Council of Australia. Her work involved policy analysis, research, and advocacy on issues affecting people seeking asylum and refugees. Shakufa is a deputy chair of the National Refugee-Led Advocacy. Let me start again. She is a deputy chair of the National Refugee-Led Advisory and Advocacy Group, NRAG, as well as an advisory committee member of UNSW Caldwell Center for International Refugee Law. She's also one of the executive board members of Academic Society that helps with the education of girls, youth, and children in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So welcome, panel members. We're here to, I guess, kick off the conference and talk about the theme, rebuilding resilience and innovation. So for everyone watching, you can actually ask us questions by putting a question in the Q&A box. And if it's for a specific panel member, please mention their name and we'll have time at the end for questions. So I'll kick off with you, Rahila. The whole world's been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. The impacts have been, documented and reported. As a person from a refugee background who's actively involved at grassroots level with refugee and asylum seeking communities in Western Sydney, can you describe to us what you've seen in this past 18 months during the pandemic? How have the community responded to this pandemic? Okay. Rahila?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Adama, and I would like to also pay my respect to the custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respect to all the elders past, present, and emerging. And thank you so much, Adama, for that question and for putting me in spot first. I appreciate it. I'd like to get started with talking about the past 12 months and seeing how the community, the refugees and asylum seekers have contributed to combating the COVID-19 in Australia. So let me begin with acknowledging that today I'm representing myself, and I'm not representing any of the organizations that I currently work with or have worked with in the past, and any of the talks in which I would talk about any work placement or my personal experiences are not related to my current work placement and the places that I can talk to or relate to publicly. Just putting that so that everyone is clear that I'm not representing any specific organizations today. So in combating COVID-19 in Australia, the community of refugees and asylum seekers have played an important role, from getting innovative and their willingness to keep the community safe in Australia to coming up with their solutions and identifying the needs in the community. The community of refugees have tried their best to keep everyone safe and do whatever in their capacity to make sure that we in Australia are doing our best to combat COVID-19. I just want to also, Adama, sort of talk about the resilience in the community and how that resilience was displayed and where does that come from. So I want to just take the time to personally go back to where my family started and how it has led to later on in Australia fighting COVID-19 and displaying that resilience while we sort of fight a global pandemic. So my family fled Afghanistan in 2009 due to risk of persecution and harm against them. And when I was about 6 years old, I was denied the basic right to get education in Afghanistan. While I tried to attend school, dressing up as a boy, several threats were made against my family, and that sort of led to my family later on sort of fleeing that persecution and harm and becoming refugees. Some of the memories that I have from my childhood and the type of war and persecution we were facing some of them were quite horrific to look back to, but I would give you some examples. So at around age 5 or 6, when wars were, any type of war or conflict would start, you just never knew when it's going to escalate and when you would have to leave your home and run. So I remember at night sleeping, and then in the middle of the night, my mom would just be shaking me to wake me up and say, we have to run. We have to run for our lives. And this would be in rush and quiet. You just have to run in the mountains because there is an attack on your village, or there is a conflict going on between two parties and your life is at risk. And another example of when we were trying to cross the borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and there is shooting going on the border, and you have to run for your life. You have to take the risk, and to stay alive, you just have to make sure that a bullet doesn't hit you or any members of your family. So that's the kind of risk that were involved in us becoming refugees and fleeing war and conflict. After coming to Pakistan and then going through again different forms of discrimination, being subject to target killing in Pakistan, as well as ethnic minorities living in Pakistan, and the risks associated with that. There were days when I would be walking to school, but not any single hope that I would return. And so every day you would be saying goodbyes, like you won't see each other again to say hi. But finally, my father took the horrific journey to Australia by boat, and making that journey safe to Australia meant a hope for my family and a hope of regaining life again and living in a peaceful society. Luckily, my father was able to make it to Australia and bring us to Australia, and to have the privilege of being called an Australian now. I think when a global pandemic hit, everyone was in panic, including people from refugee and asylum seeker backgrounds in Australia and in Western Sydney. But I think one thing that I can proudly say that the community did so well was using that resilience, practice of resilience in their past, and bringing it to life in the present, and staying calm and knowing that in fighting a COVID-19 and a global pandemic, you just have to stay calm and do best as you can. I remember my father saying to me, if you want to fight a global pandemic, you just have to keep in mind that you need to fight with your mind and heart, and you take care of others as well as taking care of yourself. So use that strength, use that resilience that you have to practice, and make sure that you're keeping everyone safe. And most of the time my dad just said to us, just don't panic, but also remember that what you have overcome and what you're capable of overcoming in the future. And I think that sort of resonated a lot with me and the community around me, because it just meant that we were not alone. And this was not another time of just, the unknowing was much less than the times that we had, the types of threats that we had to overcome in the past. So the resilience that were displayed in the community was just amazing. And it just meant that, yes, we have overcome so much, but we are also prepared and willing to do more and keep the community safe in Australia. So that's the kind of resilience that I have witnessed in the community, Adama. And I'm sure that there are a lot of personal stories, and we have seen it everywhere, how the community got creative and innovative in combating COVID-19. I remember my sister sort of telling me that today, when she was outside and trying to do as much as she can, but also sort of the unknowing in how she can help and what is the right thing to do, she would always be willing to do as much as she could, interpret, and also help families get the right information. And I think from young people to all the elders in the community, everyone were willing to help as much as they could.
Yeah, so thank you, Rahila. I think from your reflection, it's really clear that, you know, the community has played an important role in supporting each other during this pandemic, but also that those systems of support have been there. It's like a natural byproduct of this resettlement journey and the search for safety that they've experienced. So I think it's, you know, they have, it's something that probably came natural from what you've said to me. And I know that within my own community from Sierra Leone here in Western Sydney, that's definitely, people relied on each other, were able to provide support to each other during a time, unprecedented times that we haven't seen before. So I guess I'll move on to you, Shakufa. In terms of, I guess, what this past 18 months, what's happening is, you know, people are saying, look, it's time, the pandemic has hit. Should we rethink how we do things as a sector, as the whole world, really rethinking how we do things? And I guess, to use an overused phrase, how can we build back better? So I guess in terms of your experience, you've worked in the sector in a professional capacity, working with refugees and advocacy. You've also had personal work in a grassroots level. I guess some question I put to you is, how can the sector learn from this? How can we learn, and what can we do differently moving forward in terms of the refugee and asylum seeker space?
Good morning, everybody. I firstly would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I meet from the land of Darug people. It's really nice to be here in your warm company in such a cold morning. But, you know, thank you, Rahila, for reflecting on your experiences on what resilience means practically. I think it's important to, you know, be reminded of, I suppose, experiences firsthand that reflect that resilience. And I think that's just one example. And I think across communities, there is that inbuilt resilience, because resilience, I think, to me, it means that, you know, bouncing back from negative experiences and disturbances in the case of refugees from situations of war and conflict, but also actually then translating that when conditions are provided into something positive, into a strength. And so given that context, I think that with resilience comes both challenges and potentials. Of course, you know, potentials, we see it across communities, you know, refugee communities across Australia, across the world, have actually in large part formed their own support structures that unfortunately remain invisible due to many reasons that I will later talk about. And I think that that resilience also comes from the fact that the experiences have been shared with refugee communities. And I think that that sense of collective flight, collective solidarity, and collective sort of trauma and collective displacement, collective loss, and all of that, I think that provides a premise for collective thinking in terms of solving and problems and solutions. And so that also creates collective ambition. And I think that for a long time, community-based organizations that have worked for refugee communities have really based their resources and capacity on goodwill, because there is that shared ambition to actually rebuild communities in a new home. And I think that they have been effective in many fronts. For instance, that sort of collective goodwill has meant that in large part community-based organizations in Australia, for example, have been able to be part of like the international refugee protection, aid and development. And often this remains sort of unrecognized, but they have played undoubtedly a very significant role in back home in terms of protection. So in that sense, they have remained sort of the first responders across the world internationally. But also beyond that, I think that when resettling in Australia, communities have been the first port of call. There is that inbuilt trust between communities, and specifically between ethno-specific communities that we don't often actually explore, or actually don't have, the sector hasn't had capacity to work with individually. But there's so much strength inside communities that comes from that resilience that have been inbuilt with refugees having to make really tough decisions in their life to benefit their own communities in Australia. And I think also when it comes to the ongoing work and sustainability of the work, I think I said that resilience is both a challenge and a potential. I think when it comes to challenges, because all of most of the work is actually premised on volunteerism, it really creates a potential to build communities, but also it really normalizes volunteerism, normalizes goodwill as the only resource that community has at their disposal. And I think that there is that significant social and economic capital that's represented by refugee community organizations and volunteerism, because they are operating in a very complex funding environment. But also when it comes to public support, there's a lot of competition, for instance, even in the sector for refugee community-based organizations.
Can I ask you a question there? Sorry to interrupt you. Just thinking, so you talked about refugee-led or refugee communities working in an informal setting. Why is that the case? I mean, what are the barriers to move to more formalizing the work and moving from voluntary capacity to a formal setting? What are some of the things that need to happen to make that more formal?
I think, like I said, it goes back to the idea that refugee communities or ethnic-specific refugee communities have significantly relied on their volunteerism inside the community to actually carry out any sort of support inside the communities, and that in large part have remained unrecognized. And so therefore there hasn't been a sort of inbuilt structures or stronger structures inside communities that have held themselves throughout the time to keep helping communities. And I think that has also meant that there has been a bit, deprivation or lack of access to funding or specifically financial support to keep these structures going, but also not just financial support, but actually making sure that these the structures are strong enough to or professional enough and formal enough to actually exist in sort of environment that the rest of the sector exists. And so I think that the sort of over reliance on the community been instrumental for communities themselves in the long run. As a short-term sort of measures, it's sometimes useful to have that, but I think in long term it really does undermine sort of the need for stronger structures and resource structures.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. I think that yes, financial support to formalize and to actually get people in a paid capacity to move from informal to a formal structure is important. And as you mentioned, it is quite a competitive sector in the not-for-profit space to be able to secure financial backing for projects, not one-off, but ongoing core funding for organisation. It is an ongoing challenge. So I guess I'll put this question to all three of you, Shakrifa, Atem and Rahila. You've all had experience at the grassroots level and, trying to move to a formal capacity. Working in a voluntary capacity and a professional capacity, how has this impacted on you and what are your reflections on this?
Hi, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Look, I would like, first of all, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm sort of zooming from. And this is Bijigol land. And I'm in my house. And this is the thing I love about Australia. You can be in your pajamas and, you know, in an international conference speaking. So this is my backyard. So don't be alarmed about what you see. Look, the question of recognizing and even rewarding the work that communities, ethnic communities do is very significant. And like Shakufa has said, that kind of work and the structures that are built and sustained over a very long period of time with little support from anywhere actually takes away from that work that has been done. And the impact is refugee communities and their structures come across as dysfunctional, as incapable, as less resilient. And all this, I think, is also to do with the way the system is structured. So our systems that support refugees when they arrive and when they settle, put one community against another, in the sense that you arrive today, you are the focus of the world. Tomorrow, nobody wants to know you. You're off, and the next group comes in, and so you create this situation where people who have just arrived, who are now actually about to really, do the good work that they have started, when they got all the good support and all the, intensive support that they needed in the beginning, suddenly they can't move on. Suddenly they are left by themselves, and that has a lot of ramification within the community. And I think, for me personally, I think it's a little bit puzzling, because when you have, and we have heard, people like Professor Peter Shergold talking this morning, we also heard from Leanne, when you have people so powerful and speaking the way they were speaking, and really, like, you go, what's wrong with Australia? And there are many people in Australia like that, who actually have the heart and saying, look, we need to do this better. If Professor Peter Shergold sits there and tells you, I've been doing this for 30 years and nothing changed, then the problem, I think, is elsewhere. We need to actually look outside.
So what are some of those things that we need to look at then?
Right.
What are some of those different things, the innovations or the new ways to do things?
I think we need to begin to change our way of looking and thinking about refugees and people generally, especially disadvantaged people. For refugees, first of all, you are put in a box of the vulnerable people, because you are a refugee, you have had trauma, displacement and all that, okay? Which is stuff that, refugees do go through. I did go through before I came to Australia, okay? So that's important to acknowledge. However, that becomes what defines refugee. That is what becomes to define refugee communities. And so that definition needs to shift. You are not defined by your trauma, because trauma is something that happens to you. In Australia, for example, recently you had bushfires. People lost things. People fled like refugees. That was a refugee experience. But nobody talked to these people and say to them, you are traumatized. You are poor people. Actually, they are seen as people who have resilience, who have survived something significant, and whatever they want is provided to support them rebuild. Okay, and they are actually put up very high as people that Australian people look up to, because they have gone through an experience, a horrible one, and they came through it. Okay, that means Australians haven't gone through it. In the case of refugees, no, actually that experience then becomes what defines you. And that experience becomes the way the whole system is built around. So a service provider has to say, this group is traumatized, to get money to provide the services that these people need. Community leaders also have to speak discursively. They also have to say, we are traumatized. You know, we need to move away from that. And we need to begin to think about how do you treat people with dignity? How do you actually embed dignity into our thinking in policy, in service delivery, in the way we engage with refugee communities? How do we shift the language away from defining people as trauma victims to people who have actually gone through something difficult, but they have come on the other side as more empowered people? Because you go through trauma, it's character building. You know, you understand the world much better than someone who hasn't had any experience. And so that is very important. It's also important, I think, to begin to look at refugee communities. And you know, I thank the Refugee Council for creating a position for, you know, deputy CEO who should be a refugee person. And I'm glad that, you know, Adama is now doing that. That to me is the sort of things we need to do, because now Adama sits at a place where she has some influence, or at least in the Refugee Council of Australia. And I'm more comfortable to talk to Adama about the way I feel about things than to talk to Paul, because sometimes I think, although Paul is very generous and very understanding, and I do speak to him, I'm more likely to go, you know, Adama, you understand because you have my experience. I don't have to struggle to explain things to you.
That's very kind of you, Tim. That's very kind. But I just want to draw out your point about language, and the importance of language and how we describe people and their experiences. You know, and you mentioned the word vulnerable, and I have to admit that's one of the words that I do not like in terms of describing people. In previous conversations, you and I have talked about that word vulnerable, and we've talked about vulnerable people versus a person being in a vulnerable circumstance. Are you able to elaborate more on that for us?
Okay, so like I said earlier, the idea is to separate the situation where people find themselves, and the person, because people are more than the situation that they find themselves. So if you find someone who is homeless, for example, okay, which is sadly becoming a more common thing, that homelessness doesn't define them. That is just a situation they find themselves in now. They are more than that homelessness. And so if you define that person as homeless, then you have really diminished this person to nothing. When, if you go, okay, this person is actually someone who has capacity, who has resilience, who has the ability to turn around the situation, then the conversation you're going to have with this person and the way you look at them is going to be completely different, because you're talking to someone you think has the capacity to change the world in a way that works for them, not in the way you want, you know, them. So the issue, and you know, and this goes to language. The issue is we know what happens with refugees. So in Australia, the media reflects the Australian community. Okay, and what tend to happen most of the time, refugees, humanitarian entrants, asylum seekers, the way the media portrays them and the way people see what the media reflects to them about these people, they are refugees, they are asylum seekers, they are queue jumpers, they are people who can settle, they people who, you know, can integrate, they are a problem. So people in Australia, the majority of people who have never met a refugee in their life can walk on the street and start saying refugees are bad people. Refugees cannot, you know, integrate. Refugees cannot do this and that. They are, you know, when it's not right. And there is a problem here that we also need to do a bit of work on. How come that the media just does that and nobody says anything? How come that politicians can run around and say, you know, this community is that to win elections? You know, the Victorian election, for example, sorry, I'm taking it out of the, you know, somewhere else. The Victorian election, for example, the last one where South Sudanese and African young people became gang, you know, or where, like, you know, people are not going out in Melbourne because of African gang, because of South Sudanese gang. People need to understand how much damage that does, not just to these young people, but to the entire community that is settling. So this is like, you know, you move up in your settlement and suddenly you hear something in the media for a couple of days and your settlement journey goes back. You really go really bad, and you begin to question even, was it worth it coming to Australia? And I think what we need to begin to do as systems and as people, we need to begin to think about when refugees come, what do they want? Because all of us, when we come here as refugees, we are hopeful, we are very ambitious, we want to do all sorts of things. But we come into a system that tells us you're vulnerable, you are, you know, you are traumatized, you are, you know, you have to present yourself as that. Because if you don't get help. For example, if you look at the humanitarian settlement program at the moment that is delivered by SSI, for example, the assessment they do, and I'm happy to be corrected, the assessment they do when people arrive is they look at you. If you show any little sense of ingenuity and resilience, yeah, you are okay, move on. And if you show that you can't do anything for yourself, you are the person that everybody wants to pick up and you know, support. And that's fine. But
you're suggesting those who have signs of agency need assistance as well?
Yeah, they do need assistance as well. What I'm saying is the system only try to provide any sort of help because the framing is you have to be vulnerable. So if you are not vulnerable, you can actually be vulnerable, but if you come across, because there are people who are, you know, you can be really vulnerable, but proud. So you really cannot show your vulnerability. And so someone else who doesn't know you will think, oh yeah, you know, you're fine. You know, when you are actually the most vulnerable person, you know. So I think we need to shift the way we look at what we do. And I think if we look at ideas like dignity and begin to think about people as human beings, and then see them as people who have resilience, who have capacity, who have ambition, who can actually do things for themselves, and then go from there and go, what do you want me to help you with to get to where you want to get? If someone said, I want to be an engineer, what's wrong with that? In Australia, you are told, look, with your year 4 education, yeah, just go and do dance and music. You're an African anyway, that's what works for you. You know, so you are discouraged.
So Tam, I'm going to, Shakufa, I'm going to defer to Shakufa. There's something she'd like to say, and there's actually some comments coming through that I'll put to the panel as well. So Shakufa, sorry, you were going to say something just now?
Oh no, I was just.
So Rahila.
To add to what Atem.
Yep.
Yeah, Adama, I just wanted to sort of go back to the question you raised earlier about, you know, Shakufa, I and Atem sort of being involved in advocacy and grassroots work, and how that sort of has had impacts on us. But personally, talking about myself, I think being involved gives me pleasure, and being able to do something for the community and being able to advocate, that gives me a lot of strength, and it empowers me personally. But also, what does it mean when you sort of are willing to give a lot of yourself and be at the grassroots and be willing to do everything in your power, but not see any visible change that you're hoping to achieve? I think it becomes very consuming. It takes a lot out of you, but something that doesn't let you give up is the hope that slowly we can achieve some form of change. And I think that as advocates, and even myself with my advocacy work, I sort of do it without expecting anything in return. But often when you are in that in the grassroots level and working your way, you sort of it becomes really consuming, and it takes a lot out of you, but you start framing yourself in the frame that other people puts you in. So you often are just only seen as a former refugee. None of your other abilities and capabilities are seen and appreciated, and you're almost all the time put in that category of being vulnerable, being a refugee, and advocating only because you are a refugee. that's your role to advocate for refugees, or that just because you're a former refugee and you have that experience, it's your job and it's your duty. But I wish that more people from all walks of their life could come along and say, hey, even though I don't have that experience, I think I can play a role. I think I see where it's all going wrong, and I can do whatever in my ability, a capability to advocate. And that's where I just want to put this call out to every participant here to take some kind of active role, where even if it is from taking a conversation to your family, to friends, or even standing out when you hear something that is not right, or maybe sounds discriminatory. So I think that as people from refugee background, it's nowhere in our job description to be advocates for refugees. But I also want to appreciate that a lot of people out there are doing best they can, but I also want to invite and open the floor for everyone to jump in and do something as little as starting a conversation.
Okay, thank you, Rahila. I think Shakufa, are you going to respond?
No, I was just going to add to the point that Atem previously raised, and the fact that he talked about sort of this beneficiary role that refugee communities are expected to just play, and the fact that the sort of the dignity gets a little bit lost in there, and I think that deficit view has existed for a very long time, and if you have, I think we need to start changing that and seeing obviously refugee communities for more than just their experiences. Experiences are attributes of a human being in ways that it's shaped their life but doesn't become the person. I think that we get it a little bit mixed up when we conclude refugees based on their experiences. And I think that even with shared stories, I think the sector, or maybe the world at large, actually only actually gets convinced that you're refugee enough if you are sort of you cognitively trigger them in ways that they expect to be triggered by your trauma, and that is probably the basis that has singularly been responsible for this deficit view that refugees are probably damaged goods that needs to be treated. They are only confined to being beneficiary. And I think that when it comes to even Atem, you talked about sort of the settlement side of things, and the fact that refugee communities are not formally part of their own settlement is telling of that they're only confined to being identified as beneficiaries and not necessarily actors or collaborators that actually can have significant impact in their own communities. And I think going forward, systemizing sort of this disenfranchised outlook towards refugee communities leads to more systematic issues in sort of limiting refugee community-based structures. So we need to move beyond that and actually see them as more than just beneficiaries, and actually really important actors that need to be part of solutions for their communities and for themselves, and not define them just by their experiences. And I think that when we shift that dynamic to giving them the refugee communities and that autonomy to define their own experiences and their own identity beyond experiences, that's, I guess, one of the starting points where we start to actually then extend them beyond just the beneficiary model that we have, or the deficit view that has been actually the case for a while.
Okay, guys, the chat box is going off. We've got lots and lots of questions. So I have to say we may not get through all your questions today, but we'll do our best. We've got 8 more minutes left of this session. So we'll do our best to get through many questions. So there was a question in chat box about LGBTQI+ people who during the pandemic were shunned by their communities and didn't actually get support. Do one of you want to respond to that? Atem, I think you were going to respond.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. Look, it's unfortunate that that has happened, but it's not a surprise. And I'm saying this because also within our communities, we also have real challenges that we also need to deal with. So the issue of support, and you can see this in communities, for example, where gender is a problem, where if you were a woman, you are in a less vulnerable situation, and there are situations where you wouldn't get help because you are a woman, you are asking for certain things that the community may see as things that women shouldn't be asking for. And so my response to that is, it's unfortunate. And I think in terms of our communities, the LGBTQI is a significant challenge. In 2016, when there was it referendum or plebiscite about gay marriage and those unions that should be acknowledged publicly. I used to work for Mayan, and actually when I did the interview, there was a question about that there's this happening, there's a campaign going on, how do you think refugee communities, migrant communities, refugee young people could be supported in that? And my response to it was that actually refugee communities, if they are educated about the situation of LGBTQI people, they are actually more likely to understand that situation, because we come from situations where we were persecuted, where we were the other, and we are still the other here. We are still the other. That's why we are having this conversation. And so I think part of the work that needs to be done, and we all need to do it, Refugee Council of Australia and everybody else, is actually to begin having a conversation with our refugee communities, and ARCAN included, to begin to say, look, these are people, these are members of our community. We cannot shun them. They may have a different way of doing things or thinking, or they're actually not different. They just decided to, live some aspect of their life differently. We all do that. Maybe other people don't know, but we all do that in our community. So I think there is a lot of education that need to happen. And I think service providers and advocates who support refugees and refugee communities need to actually begin to have those conversations with refugee communities, because the impact is terrible. And the stories are really concerning.
Yeah. So thank you for raising that question. I don't know, it was an anonymous panelist, and I thank anonymous person, and thank you for raising that. It is an important issue, and we actually do have it in the conference program that will be looking at mental health support for LGBTQI+ refugees. There is another question, and any of you can respond because I haven't directed it to any particular panel member. It's about influencing mainstream media. How much reach do we have in TV newspapers, and how can we change the thinking in terms of the labels that are used to describe refugees? Who'd like to respond? Shakrifa, Rahila?
Okay.
Adama, I think I would like to give Shakrifa more time. She really does sort of talk about this in a very beautiful manner. So I think that having refugee-led advisory groups and refugee-led campaigns, or I'd say projects, would really be one way. And I think the work that Shakrifa and the NRAC team is doing is amazing. I've just been reading about it last night, and I think that it's such an important step towards sort of informing the type of work that needs to be done. And I'm not saying that there hasn't been works as such done before, but in a manner where refugees are being put as the lead, and they are informing and leading that kind of change, is beautiful. And I think it is very impactful. And I think, Shakrifa, you would be able to talk more about it, because it is something that you have initiated, and I think it's amazing.
Oh, thank you, Rahila. Thanks for the kind words. I have to acknowledge my NRAC colleagues as well as supporting organizations like Refugee Council, who have at the initial stages really supported in terms of the logistical and practical support. And it was helpful that at the time I was actually working as a staff with Refugee Council as well. But I think it was an ambition that we all had in common, and it came into fruition, at least at the very initial stages of formation. But in saying that, I do acknowledge that a lot of challenges lies ahead, and I think that I provide a context of why volunteerism is not sustainable, and that we need to actually practically extend support in terms of making these structures strong enough to make a difference in the long term. And I think the question was about a sort of media narrative, and I think when it comes with strong voices, it comes with really solid, not deficit-based voices. I think that people kind of like are interested on the traumatic side of it naturally, but I think we have to take control of that narrative and say that control the narrative really. We need to be comfortable about how much we share, how much we don't want to share, and things that we expect to sort of to make an impression, I suppose. But while you talked about NRAG, we have actually a dialogue on 8th of July. So I wanted to use this opportunity to give a heads up to people who are, people from refugee backgrounds who are attending this conference right now to make a registration. I tried to actually paste a link here, but I couldn't do that. I don't know if I can do that, but so it's all about actually empowering the affected communities to an extent that they can actually speak for themselves, and they're not just there as a prop or symbolically present. So it's about power shifting and slowly getting there in terms of power dynamics, even when it comes to the media.
Just for 30 seconds, Adama, because this is finishing now. I think with the media, what we need to really see is a lot more diversity in that, including people with refugee backgrounds, because one of the problems that refugee communities are always talked about is the English language and the issues around English language. So I would like to see that refugee communities represented a lot more in the media, not as the stories, but as people who are actually working in the media and actually telling the stories from their perspective. And if that can happen, I think things could change. Otherwise, nothing's going to change.
Thank you. I feel our time, we could go on and on. I think the conversation is just beginning, but thank you, Atem, Shakrifa and Rahila, for spending time with us this morning to kick off this conference. I think we've raised a couple of points and things and perspectives that I think we would like the conference delegates to think about over the next couple of days and really reflect on and think about how, how perhaps they can really reflect on their own practice if they're working in the sector and working with people seeking asylum and refugees, and think about, okay, what can we do differently? And that's what this conversation is about. This conference is about, hearing from people with lived experience and hearing it directly from them and seeing how we can learn, listen and learn from them and grow as practitioners in this space, but also maybe validating our own experiences of people, for people who've lived this experience and journey. So thank you everybody for joining us this morning. We are committed to, continual improvement. So we are, throughout this conference, after every session, there's going to be a short survey, which will take you literally a minute or two for you all to complete. That will be coming up on your screen right now. I'll also put in the chat box. So take a couple of minutes to fill it out, and you'll be able to do that for every session. I think I'm going to hand over now to Kween G, who will who will have a chat to you before we move on to the morning tea break. So thanks for joining us again.
Thank you very much, Adama, and thank you to those amazing panelists. That was a really it was a really good conversation. I enjoyed listening to it. A lot of thoughts, a lot of things to think about. Yes, as Adama mentioned, there is an evaluation survey. Please fill that in while I'm having a quick chat to you. And don't forget, you will go in the draw to win a hard copy of Share a Meal, Share a Story cookbook. And the links can be found through the Humanities Virtual Hub. We're going to have a short morning tea break. Please make sure that you take some time off and away from your screen, blink your eyes, take a stretch. Got to look after your bodies and your minds. Can't be sitting down all morning. Make a cup of tea, which I'm about to have. And we'll be locking back in at, the break is for 30 minutes. And we are running a bit behind time. So if we can come back in about 20 minutes, if that's enough time for everyone. Otherwise, I will get confirmation if we are doing the full 30-minute break. And when we do return, our next session will be centering community, organizing and grassroots work in the refugee sector. So I'll give you some more info on that when we do come back from our morning tea break. Yeah, so please enjoy your morning tea break. And if anyone has any questions, the Q&A chat box is there.